All right. I'm going to cover Carrier. This is the old Victory Games solitaire game. And I'm afraid that this is going to be a somewhat torturous route. So to begin with, I got this game as a gift from a viewer who I think really wanted me to cover it. And that's part of why I'm doing it. He first offered me an unpunched copy if I promised to cover it in a year, and I really don't know. I was at the point where I had EU sitting on the burner with no question already, kind of sitting as a sword of Damocles over my head. Not that I haven't played EU several times before, and a number of really that are still largely there, really kind of longish games that a lot of people want me to play. So I couldn't commit, and I would not have gotten it done within the year. Well, I would have made a point of doing so if I could agree. But then he had a spare copy, and he sent that to me. And for that, I'm very thankful. I mean, I love Victory Games games, and this is an interesting game. The problem I have is that tackling this rule book, and yeah, it's a meaty one. It's 67 pages, 68. Every time I read through it, I know what the game's going to be about. It's representing Japanese forces, plans, invasions, counterstrikes, this, that, and the other, in a solitaire system so that the U.S. player can run a couple of task forces and still be surprised by where the Japanese are, what they're like, etc. But in order to run all of that and to get a realistic deployment and realistic activities by the Japanese player, a tremendous amount of rules are in play, including tons and tons of these charts. And this is, I've got two screens of folders and basically two extra pages of charts and tables. Then there's several around the map. None of it's terribly difficult to cope with from what I can see. I've only played one scenario so far. The one that I felt would most enlighten me towards how I'm going to play, which is essentially a search officer scenario. It's kind of in the middle of the introductory scenarios. It allows you to see the search mechanisms in play. But there are a lot of others. The airstrikes that the Japanese generate out of unknown forces. You may not even know what's there, and you might get hit with an airstrike. And it's all done in a way that won't, at least this is the impression I get, that isn't going to create some kind of anomaly that you look at and say, wow, that's unbelievable. In a game like Midway, which is less historically accurate than this, you have another player, to handle all the staging operations and all that kind of stuff. So you can get away with, 12, 16 pages of rules in one of those tiny little things, right? I read about this big. This doesn't get away with that. Now, this is more detailed. There's no question of that as well. All right. Well, here goes it. So, the problem for me is I've read through the rules and I just don't get them. The only way I get them is by following through them and playing through piece by piece. And I'm a very impatient man. So, at least where it comes to games, putting out these all these kind of introductory scenarios, I could play the one, but then I said, I can't do another one. So in a sense, I'm going to be learning the game while I do the playthrough. I'm going to give a little bit of an introduction to the rules. I'm not going to try to go too deeply into them, I don't think, because I don't know them well enough. All right. So you got a sequence of play that doesn't look too bad. It's just one page. And the first thing you have to do is determine what Japanese forces arrive on the map. At the beginning, and I'm doing one of the historical scenarios with all the optional rules and everything that you've got in play. This is me. What you've got is two forces separated out for this scenario. One force is, I believe, heading for New Hebrides. Maybe I'm mistaken there. Maybe it's Guadalcanal. Yeah, I better look that much up. And yes, to actually get this started, I had to have something to drink. I could have done it, solo without a problem. I'm going to be doing the Coral Sea May 5th through 8th, 1942. There's specifics in the game to handle the different ships that are actually in existence at any particular time, which is important because ships kind of appear randomly. So the Japanese, so the Japanese are going, their primary objective is Port Moresby, and their secondary is going to be Guadalcanal, so not New Hebrides. Yeah, that wouldn't make sense. Port Moresby? Not used to it being that far over on a map. I'm used to the whole Pacific theater being played out. That's going to be these orange counters, and they're separated into combat vessels, which could be carriers, they could be surface units, they could also be dummies, and groups of transport ships as well. These are going to be for task forces. The secondary one for Guadalcanal is these red counters. And there's a distinguishment on the map where there's these little mission movement markers, which as long as you're under mission movement, if you're in an area delineated by these dashed lines, I suppose, a die roll at the beginning of each movement phase determines which way ships move, how directly towards their target they're going to head for the Japanese activities. And Japanese will always have somewhere they're trying to get to with their fleets. There may be scenarios where the U.S. is trying to land troops. I haven't looked carefully enough to see that. This one is not such. So, at the beginning of the game, there are going to be no Japanese on the map for this scenario, but the U.S. is going to have a couple of task forces, and I have a lot of latitude as to where to put them, and I've got to kind of think about that a little bit. But in general, I want to protect the primary and secondary targets. I know where the Japanese are heading. And U.S. intelligence was fairly good. They knew which ships were in the area, and that's going to be reflected by these indicators up here, the commitment levels for transport, surface ships, and carriers. I don't know specifically what ships are going to be there yet, but I do have an idea how much force the Japanese are willing to commit here. And the limitation here, new things are going to not necessarily show up based on, I think these counters can show up even if they're sufficient, even if commitment is ever met. But they can't generate anything. So that's kind of something to keep in mind. Okay, and then wherever the Japanese come in, there's a possibility for them to immediately be searched for if they're in the range of my search ships. Search planes. I hope that's the right one. Okay. Then we go to a series of 4 action phases. And in the action phases, essentially, the Japanese are going to pull... I've got a pile somewhere. They're going to pull these black chips, which are basically activation markers. Right now I've got dummies, and I've got certain specific ones for PBY, which I don't know what it stands for, and Rabaul, which is a Japanese air base. Should be kicking around somewhere. Thought it's up here. Is that it? That looks like it. Okay. And I guess that airbase could lend out airstrikes, etc. During each movement, what I do is I roll a die to determine heading towards the areas that they're heading for. And the different colors correspond to different possible targets. In this game, I believe I'm going to be dealing with Port Moresby, which is orange, and I'm going to be dealing with Guadalcanal, which is following these red things, which of course center in towards that. I roll a die to see if I'm not in the area where my target is, how I move. Once I get into the area of the target, I go into these very specific rules of how to approach the target. Also, there's very specific rules on how to cope with U.S. ships that are very, very close. Somewhere or another. And yeah, there's a standard game where you actually get to purchase your U.S. ships. Somewhere or another, I have a chart which is going to indicate, I don't remember what I'm going to do here, close action from Japanese ships. This is the force arrival. And, you know, I mean, there's a lot of complexity there built into these charts, but when you're actually looking at them, it's just a matter of finding the right ones at any given time. I can't find the close, I've not used it yet, the close response chart. This is not it, that's the sequence of play. There it is. Close reaction chart. And that kind of determines, based on the type of ship that the Japanese have and the type of ship they're facing, what the chances of different operations are and what you're going to do there. Okay. So that's by a die roll. Maybe I cheated in my solo scenario by rolling tens as zeros. Maybe I was supposed to roll as tens. I know I came out very, very ahead of the maximal victory conditions for that. Okay. So when the Japanese move, you move these forces, you don't know what's in them necessarily, although they may have little markers to give you some indications, and those can get pretty specific. In fact, they can get down to, at the final level, the specific ships that the Japanese have in a force, in which case I'm hoping there's some sort of little task force markers. There seems to be a space for them. I don't know. I have not seen markers for them, but I haven't dug into this bag, which might be where they exist. In order to coordinate which force has which specific ships. You also have, and I do not have any of these, some record charts, which I'm going to have to make handmade copies of. I have no photocopying, to keep track of what's going on in each of the Japanese forces, and you should also have something similar for the U.S. forces here. And that should be it. Okay. So Japanese movement is determined somewhat at random by the die rolls, and somewhat by the system within that. It's determined by the system with some randomness involved in it. If the Japanese move in a range that you've already searched, that you have planes that you've committed to searching, which is indicated by them being in these used boxes, you get to search again as they move, just to give you another shot to find more information about them. The Japanese also, I believe, get a chance to launch an airstrike at this point. Yep. On your ships. And I don't know how that's determined. I really don't. I have not played a scenario that allows for that, so we're going to be exploring that as we play. But again, I think that's kind of random because as the U.S. player, you shouldn't know whether the Japanese know where you are or not. It takes some of the kind of fun for me out of the system. I think I'd enjoy something like Flat Top more. I certainly enjoy Midway a lot, where I'm playing against somebody and I've got that kind of, I know where you are and you don't know where I am. Even though that may not be a historical position for the captains to necessarily be in, it's better to have an umpired situation. I find something kind of fun about that ahistorical little piece. But here you don't have that. Here you have, you know, a simulation really of the position that the American admiral is going to be in. or admirals in this case. Okay, so then after the Japanese take their play, the United States gets to do a movement. Now their movement, so the Japanese movement is limited by, there's going to be a number of forces in play at any given point. And that's going to indicate how many counters there are of that, the orange and red type there. And there's also yellow, and I guess that's it. Which are the different targetings. And each scenario basically has the Japanese going after 2 targets. The forces in play will determine how many chits you pull out of a cup for Japanese activation during the Japanese player turns in each of these segments. So if you pull 3 chits, well, there's a good chance early in the game that those 3 chits are going to be, blanks. The more forces are on the board, the more chits are going to be there. Right now we're at 0 forces. I don't know what that means. But as soon as we get up to 1 on the board, which is probably at the beginning of the game, we'll be drawing 2 chips for the Japanese each activation. And you can see 1, 2, 3, that it leaves only 1 left over. So if there was 1 force on the play, each activation would get 2 chits drawn. Okay. Now, for the U.S. activations, it's a little different. The U.S. is also based on how many forces, how many fleets they have, or task forces or whatever in play. They start out with only 2, and I think that's what I'll keep unless I divide my forces unwisely. And that means on the 1st and 3rd activation, I get to choose one to do something with. And I move it, but I believe I get to take air activations with all my fleets, no matter what. I don't have to worry about activating a particular fleet, which means I can launch planes. And the launching of planes is handled pretty simply. At the beginning of the game, I've got them all in the flight deck ready here. If I send them up into the air, they could get replaced with an airstrike marker, which I can only do if I have sort of a detected, a known target to go after. I may not know exactly where they are. I may not have their precise location down, but I have to have detected them, and I have to have some basic idea that they're there, which is indicated, and this is done through the search mechanism, by either having them precisely located or approximately located, and that'll be on top of the Japanese chit like that. At the beginning, when the Japanese come in, they're going to come in with these little chits like this. And my goal is pretty much to find them so I can start launching strikes. In order to find them, I'll launch my planes onto the search track here. And then each action phase is going to move forward 1 space. Now, these take into account how far I can search. 0 to 3 hexes, 4 to 7 hexes, then back to 0 to 3. Right? I trigger the search by dropping them into the used, and then I get to roll dice on the search table for every single force within my range. Successes, but chits that I draw out of a cup that indicate they're going to be either level 1 or 2, depending on how lucky I get, that indicate what the force is like. And in some cases, they'll tell me pretty specific, like this says 2 to 3 carriers, whereas this just says a surface force, and the equivalent to that would be a carrier force. There are also 28 of these dummy markers in there, which means I just remove the force from the map. And likewise, there's a similar procedure when I search and find transports, which are taken care of differently. They're, like I said, there's counters for combat forces and transport forces. I can tell the difference right from the very beginning on the map. If I'm drawing a transport cup, well, I'll only be expecting transport forces, which are basically going to be invasion troops going into play. All right. Now, for the U.S., what I have to do is I have to move the planes. Once I get them on the board, they either fly under an airstrike or they're on these search tracks, and eventually they come back into a landing box. Then they land onto the flight deck unready, I can lower them down into the hangar, start servicing them, and bring them back onto the board. There's all kinds of limitations as to how many planes I can move around on the boat at any given time. Whole bunch of rules to handle this kind of stuff. If you're not going to play the game, it doesn't make a lot of sense to go through them, and I think the only way to really get a feel for this kind of thing is to actually start playing with the counters and get them moving around. That's the truth with most of this game, from what I can see. Let's skim kind of through, well, at least the table of contents to get an idea of the different things that are handled here. So we've got rules to handle the different airstrikes and combat as you fly in to attack the planes. Those can come in multiple waves. It's possible that you get surprised during those. It's possible that the first wave doesn't achieve surprise and the second one does, as happened at Midway. There's just all kinds of interesting stuff that can show up here. Takes account cap. You're able to fly cap above there. That's going to help reduce the effectiveness of an attack as well as shoot down some of the bombers, etc. that come in. The Japanese tend to delegate very little to cap, as is historical for them. You've got these little training scenarios kind of mixed in to the rule book. So as you learn more and more rules, if that is a style that you like, you can play a really small scenario. I played the one, and it took maybe a couple hours of play, maybe an hour of play at most. It took me several hours because I'm constantly, let me go watch some, news show or a history show or something in between doing, one action phase and the next. The search system, which I've largely explained from a very high level, close reaction, again, I've largely explained that. I haven't explained surface combat any more than I've explained the air combat. These are things we're going to discover as we hit them, but there is a possibility of surface actions happening. They should be more likely at night. The game designer seems very aware of that, so I'm assuming it's worked into the system. Then the rules for the Japanese airstrikes and how to generate those. And here things get kind of tricky because you're using charts and everything because, well, you as the American player don't really know how many planes are aboard those ships until you get them to the level 4 where the actual ships are on the board in a task force. Instead, at the point where you might see, there's a level 1 carrier group. If that can launch a strike on you, well, you got no idea. That may not even really be there. You may be surprised. You may get an attack generated from something that doesn't even exist, I think. And that adds to some of the tension in the game. Rules for the land bases. The Americans here at Port Moresby have some planes on it. I know that there are planes on Rabaul. I have not set them up yet. I'm not sure what they're supposed to be. Damage that you take to the fleet to the ships, well, you can repair your flight deck damage. The rest of it eventually is going to tell, and your ships are going to want to turn around and leave, break off, so that you don't lose the major points for that. And the Japanese have special rules to make sure that they don't engage in banzai attacks with their carriers. They really didn't do that. They were very, very careful to try not to lose their carriers once they lost the carrier force. Although, at least one condition where they used them as bait, so that may be worked into here. I haven't looked. But if that's the case, that would be a special rule in this. That's the Japanese retirement rule to prevent the Japanese from making that kind of attack. There's a standard game which is sort of a random scenario. I chose to go for the historical scenarios because they require some of the advanced rules, and I really don't know if I'm going to play this more than once in this sitting. I feel like it's going to be a very bad game to video, basically. Just because I'm going to be constantly working over charts and everything. And it's not going to carry over as well on video as it would otherwise. And we got special rules for Rabaul, which I'm not really familiar with. Bombing the airfields to knock them out. And then there's this last scenario, the final countdown, which is if you feel the game has been screwing you over too much, you can take the USS Nimitz in, and only the Nimitz, and really beat the crap out of the Japanese with that. Modern F-14s and all kind of crap like that. Which might be a hoot for some people. It's not really my taste. All right, I'm going to load this up and then I'm going to get started. I'm sorry for not going into a really detailed description of the rules. I don't feel like I'm capable of doing that. Maybe if there's some serious desire to do so, once I've played, I'll be able to do that. Or somewhere in the middle of the game, I'll be able to come in and zoom in on specifics of I think I'll be able to zoom in on specifics of the rules as I'm going. But if there's a tremendous desire to, get the rules in a comprehensive format, yeah, maybe I'll come around to that if people really want it. All right, up it goes.